At Fort Moore, the usual morning atmosphere was suddenly broken by the sound of quick footsteps and firm commands. Master Sergeant Emily Carter, a female training instructor, stood tall in the middle of the field, assessing her troops' every movement with the sharpness of an experienced trainer. Her sharp eyes scanned the entire squad, ready to begin the day's training. However, behind her firmness and experience, Emily had a story that was much deeper than what was visible. That day, a new recruit, Private Jake Sullivan, known for his arrogant attitude and disrespect for his superiors, presented an unexpected challenge. In front of the entire squad, Sullivan stared at Emily with a look of mockery. With confidence, he stepped forward and without warning, attacked Emily in an attempt to test her abilities. The rest of the squad was shocked and fell silent, not knowing how to react. However, Emily Carter was not surprised. With a very quick and precise movement, she dodged the attack. In one smooth motion, she turned the tables. Sullivan's hands were pinned under Emily's body, held with such effective force that his body fell onto the mat. Sullivan, who had previously felt stronger and younger, could do little and could only pat the mat as a sign of surrender. The previously silent atmosphere broke into cheers from the troops who witnessed the incident. All eyes were on Emily, who stood calmly over Sullivan. However, what none of them knew was who Emily Carter really was. Behind her appearance as a stern military instructor, she was a former Navy SEAL, a soldier who had completed the most rigorous and prestigious training in the United States. Emily had fought battles that were invisible to many. She knew what it meant to survive and defeat enemies who seemed stronger. SEAL training not only trained her in combat techniques, but also shaped her into a tireless figure who was not afraid to face any challenge. The video of the incident quickly spread throughout the base. In an instant, the recording of the event went viral, attracting the attention of many people, both inside and outside the military. Many debated the role of women in the military, especially in positions that required them to face physical threats head-on. Critics doubted a woman's ability to fight on the harsh battlefield, while others began to see Emily as a symbol of courage and skill that was not bound by gender. This commotion sparked a heated discussion. Some argued that women should not be on the battlefield, while others felt that this incident simply showed that a person's abilities did not depend on their gender. Emily, who was previously known only as a tough and professional instructor, has now become a symbol of change. Many new recruits were inspired by the incident, and some even began to view Emily with newfound respect. However, this did not come without challenges. Emily faces a major challenge in maintaining her credibility. Some superiors and colleagues who do not believe in the role of women in the military begin to doubt her abilities. They begin to sneer and belittle her achievements. Some even question whether she is really fit to be a training instructor. Emily knows that she must do more than just demonstrate her physical abilities. She had to show that expertise in strategy, tactics, and leadership would determine who deserved to survive on the battlefield. The tension peaked when Emily was given the opportunity to develop a new training program. This program would not only change the military's view of women, but also provide opportunities for the next generation to have better career prospects in the military, regardless of gender. This is a huge opportunity, but Emily knows that to succeed, she must face even more challenges and fight even more doubts from those who do not believe in her. Emily stands before her troops on the field, ready to continue training, but this time with a heavier burden on her shoulders. She knows that this is not just about physical training. It is about breaking down barriers and showing that a soldier is not measured by their gender, but by their mental strength and ability to adapt and survive on the battlefield. The incident that occurred that day at Fort Moore was only the beginning of the major changes to come. Emily Carter knows that her struggle has only just begun. After the incident that shook Fort Moore, Emily Carter felt increasing pressure. Although her troops began to view her with new respect, the challenges she faced came not only from young recruits like Jake Sullivan. Some of her colleagues began to look down on her achievements. As a woman in a male-dominated world, Emily knows that every step she takes will always be scrutinized. Every decision, every move will be tested, and she must be more than just good to survive. At headquarters, Emily was given the opportunity to develop a new training program that would transform the military's view of women's roles. However, this came with a heavy burden. The program not only had to improve the overall quality of the troops, but also had to show that military training could be done effectively without relying solely on physical strength. Emily knew that this was not just about changing training methods, but also about a larger cultural change. That day, Emily stood in front of a meeting room filled with her superiors and colleagues who were full of skepticism. They were all waiting to hear how Emily, a woman in the military world, would bring about major changes in the way they trained soldiers. There, in front of the generals and senior instructors, Emily felt every eye staring at her with doubt. However, she did not let that feeling bother her. This program is not only about building confidence on the battlefield, but also about preparing soldiers to adapt to various challenges, said Emily, her voice calm but firm. We will teach them to think faster, to act smarter, not just to be stronger. However, some of her colleagues began to doubt her approach. You talk about tactics and strategy, Emily, but this is about fighting with our lives. How can we expect women to survive in situations full of violence and physical threats? Asked a senior instructor sarcastically. Emily knew that to gain approval, she had to show more concrete evidence. A plan without action would only be an empty theory. She needed time and space to prove that her methods could work, especially amid the skepticism surrounding her. However, Emily was undaunted. She knew that every great coach in history had moments where they faced skepticism. It was part of the process. Outside the meeting room, Emily decided to test her new training program. She knew that by using a more technique and intelligence-based approach, she could hone her troop skills in more realistic situations. However, she also knew that this would test their limits. The training program she planned was not your typical training. She would introduce more complex battlefield simulations, which required soldiers to think faster, work together as a team, and overcome fear with tactics that were smarter than brute force alone. The next day, Emily gathered the recruits and told them that they would undergo more intensive training that was different from the usual. This training won't be easy, but if you persevere, you will be better prepared for whatever lies ahead, Emily said seriously. However, there were some recruits who still doubted the approach that would be implemented. One of them was Private Sullivan, who, despite having been humiliated by Emily before, still looked down on training methods that prioritized tactics and strategy. So we're going to run away from the enemy and hope to win with intelligence, not strength? He asked mockingly. Emily stared at him intently. Strength can destroy, but intelligence will keep us alive, she replied confidently. The training began with a challenging simulation. Emily divided the soldiers into small groups and sent them to various simulation zones full of obstacles and threats. They had to face situations that demanded quick decisions, including taking over enemy-controlled areas, quickly treating casualties in the midst of battle, and overcoming traps and other dangers that required teamwork and strategic thinking. After hours of struggling in the simulation, Emily observed each group closely. Some groups worked very well, complementing each other and overcoming challenges with speed and intelligence. However, there were some groups that were still hesitant, relying more on physical strength and impulsive actions rather than thinking first. After the exercise was over, Emily gathered her troops. What did you learn today? She asked. Sullivan, unable to resist, stepped forward. I think we can win if we're just stronger. Emily smiled faintly, understanding that this process would take longer for some people to accept. Physical strength is important, Sullivan. But greater strength comes from the way we think and adapt to situations. You have to be able to act smart, not just hard. The statement hung in the air, and for the first time, Sullivan seemed to be pondering. Although he did not fully agree, something inside him began to change. Emily knew that this was the first step toward greater change, and even though the challenge was not over, she already saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The training that began that day would test not only the physical strength of her troops, but also their mental endurance. Emily knew this was just the beginning. There were still many obstacles to face and uncertainties to overcome. However, Emily Carter was ready to continue her fight. As time went on, the new training program introduced by Emily began to show significant results. Her troops, who had previously been hesitant and lacking in confidence, began to understand the value of an approach based more on intelligence and tactics. Even so, the process did not go smoothly. Some recruits still struggled to adapt to the more complex, teamwork-focused training methods. Nevertheless, Emily remained convinced that every soldier, male or female, could develop further if given the opportunity to think more clearly and not rely solely on physical strength. A significant turning point came when Emily decided to conduct a larger battlefield simulation involving the entire Fort Moore force. This time, the training would take place outside the usual training grounds. Emily chose a remote area that resembled a real battlefield, with dense forests, rivers, and hilly terrain that tested physical and mental endurance. Amidst the tense preparations, Emily heard whispers from some members of the force who doubted the decision to take a more strategic approach. Many thought that this training would only slow them down on the battlefield. However, Emily did not back down. She knew that the biggest challenge was not fighting the visible enemy, but the enemy within themselves, the fear, doubt, and selfishness that prevented them from working together and thinking clearly. The long-awaited day finally arrived. The Fort Moore troops were divided into several groups, and each group was given a complex mission. They had to move through dense forests, navigate rivers full of slippery rocks, and complete a series of challenges that required them to combine physical strength, intelligence, and cooperation. Their task was not only to survive, but also to win every challenge given by Emily, who acted as the commander behind all the simulations. Right from the start, the first challenge appeared. The first group had to cross a fast-flowing river, with currents strong enough to sweep away anyone who wasn't careful. Some impatient members of the team tried to jump into the water without a clear strategy. However, Emily, who was watching from a distance, immediately ordered them to return to safety. "You have to think of a way to cross this river safely," she shouted. "Don't rush. Intelligence is the key, not reckless courage." The wiser troops began to work together to build a temporary bridge from natural materials found around them. Emily watched them closely. Some troops may have still thought they could fight nature with their physical strength, but in the end, only those who relied on ingenuity and collaboration succeeded in overcoming the challenge. However, the biggest obstacle arose when the second group had to cross an area full of traps and invisible enemy patrols. They had to move carefully and quietly, avoiding detection, and continue to work together in smaller groups. This is where the main lesson of Emily's training is put to the test. The soldiers who previously thought this training was too focused on strategy begin to feel a real difference. They realize that while physical strength can defeat enemies in battle, ingenuity and careful planning are the keys to survival and victory in actual warfare. Sullivan, who had previously doubted Emily's abilities, begins to see the value in this more strategic approach. When they had to make a difficult decision in the middle of a trap-filled field, Sullivan, who had learned to trust his strategic abilities more, suggested using camouflage to distract the enemy. Emily, who was leading from behind, smiled slightly. "You're starting to understand the essence of this training," she said proudly. By the end of the exercise, the soldiers who had previously felt anxious and uncertain now looked more confident. They had not only passed the simulation with stronger bodies, but with sharper minds and tougher hearts. Emily knew that this was a big step towards the cultural change she envisioned. The soldiers, who initially thought of this training as merely a physical test, now began to understand that the real battlefield involved not only the body, but also intelligence and mental strength. However, Emily also knows that the next challenge will be much greater. Although her troops are beginning to form a more solid and intelligent team, a major change in the military's view of women, especially on the battlefield, has not yet been fully achieved. Emily still has to fight against existing stigma and doubts, both among her superiors and her troops. But for now, Emily feels a little relieved. She knows that the first step toward change has been taken. Fort Moore is now beginning to transform, and she is part of that change. Not only for herself, but for the entire army that has learned to see the great potential within themselves, no matter who they are or what gender they are. However, Emily also realizes that this journey has only just begun. Although she has succeeded in changing the mindset of some soldiers and proving that a more strategic approach can be successful, her journey to change broader views about the role of women in the military will continue to be tested. At that moment, Emily prepares for the next challenge. And she knows that no matter what happens, she will not back down. After successfully completing the challenging battlefield simulation, Emily felt that she had taken the first step toward change. Her troops were now stronger, more confident, and beginning to understand the importance of teamwork, tactics, and intelligence in surviving on the battlefield. However, Emily knew that the real challenge was not yet completely over. Behind this success, many doubts still hung over her, especially from her superiors and most of the military personnel who had not yet fully accepted the changes she had brought about. A few days after the battlefield simulation, Emily received a call from Colonel Samuel Hargrove, a high-ranking official at Fort Moore. "Master Sergeant Carter," Colonel Hargrove's voice sounded serious on the other end of the line. "We need to meet. There are things we need to discuss." Emily felt an uneasy feeling come over her. Colonel Hargrove was known for his firmness and conservative attitude when it came to change, especially when it involved women in command positions. The meeting was scheduled in the main conference room of the headquarters. Emily arrived early, dressed in neat military attire and prepared for whatever was to come. Colonel Hargrove entered with a firm step, accompanied by several other officers who seemed unhappy with her presence. "Master Sergeant," Colonel Hargrove began, "we appreciate the effort you are putting into this new training program. However, we cannot ignore the fact that your approach has not been proven in real-world situations. This program cannot be based solely on theory and conversation. It must be tested in the field with clear results." Emily looked at Colonel Hargrove calmly. "I understand, Colonel. This training is indeed in its early stages. However, I am confident that with the right methodology, we can change the way we view military training and truly prepare soldiers for the real battlefield." "But Emily," Colonel Hargrove's voice grew louder, "how effective will this training be if we face an enemy that leaves no room for strategy or ingenuity? Physical strength is everything on the battlefield." Emily held her breath for a moment. "Physical strength is indeed important, Colonel. However, remember that a bad strategy can defeat even the greatest strength. In real combat, we are not only fighting against the enemy, but also against time, circumstances, and limited resources. It's not about defeating the enemy with strength, but how we can survive and win in a situation full of uncertainty." Colonel Hargrove looked hesitant for a moment, but immediately asserted, "We will give you the opportunity to prove that your program can work effectively. However, I want to see concrete results in the near future. You will lead a field operation mission. If you succeed, I will give you more room to continue this program. But if you fail, we will review your approach." Emily knew this was an opportunity she couldn't afford to waste. The field operation she was given was the biggest test she had ever faced. A mission to hold the defensive line for 72 hours in an area full of enemy troops. They had to defend their position with limited resources and overcome threats coming from all sides. It was not just about survival, but also about proving that a strategy that prioritized intelligence could defeat brute force. That night, Emily gathered her troops to prepare for the mission. "We are facing a big test. But I am confident that we are ready. Remember, this is not about who is stronger, but who is smarter and more resilient. We will face threats with ingenuity, not just force." The troops, who had previously been skeptical, now began to believe Emily's words. They felt a new sense of hope. Emily led with enthusiasm, showing unwavering confidence. However, even though they were ready, the threat they faced could not be underestimated. The highly trained enemy forces were ready to test them. The mission began tensely. Every second felt precious. Emily and her troops had to work very carefully to maintain their position. They set up defenses around the steep hill, with whatever equipment they had. Limited resources forced them to think carefully about every step. However, shortly after they began building their defensive line, the enemy forces attacked. In the first attack, they faced long-range fire and traps that forced them to move quickly and quietly. Emily led the counterattack with tactics that relied on quick problem-solving and using the surrounding terrain to their advantage. The situation became even more difficult when the enemy forces launched a second wave of attacks, which were more organized and more ferocious. However, Emily remained calm. "Don't panic," she said as she observed the enemy forces' movements. "This is the time to use what we've learned. Stay calm and think smart. Divide into groups and coordinate." As the attack intensified, Emily decided to divert the enemy's attention using traps and unexpected counterattacks. The troops, who had previously been anxious, began to work more effectively, moving quickly and in coordination. Emily felt a deep sense of satisfaction seeing how her troops began to apply the principles she had taught them. The third day arrived, and despite continued attacks from the enemy, Emily and her troops managed to hold their ground. Not only were they able to maintain their position, but they also managed to turn the tide and repel the enemy forces. In her final meeting with Colonel Hargrove, Emily could feel the tension gradually fading from the faces of her superiors and colleagues. Colonel Hargrove finally said, "You have proven that this program can work, Emily. The results are more than we expected. We gave you this opportunity, and you succeeded." Emily smiled slightly, even though she knew that the journey was not over yet. This was only the first step towards greater change. However, with this success, Emily felt that she had finally proven that ingenuity, tactics, and cooperation were the keys to winning battles. And she was ready to continue fighting for that change, not only for herself, but for her entire team. Emily's success in the field operation mission not only affected her and her troops, but also began to attract wider attention among the military. Colonel Hargrove, who had previously been very skeptical, now gave greater recognition to the program that Emily had introduced. Even so, Emily knew that this was only the beginning of a long and challenging journey. The changes she brought about still faced many obstacles, both internal and external. A few weeks after the field mission, Emily had another opportunity to demonstrate her training abilities. Colonel Hargrove gave her a new, more challenging order. Emily was asked to train a group of elite troops from selected units to face greater and more complex threats, including situations involving guerrilla warfare and unconventional warfare. This was a golden opportunity to show that the program she had created was not only for ordinary troops, but could also be applied to units with more experience. At first, these elite troops underestimated Emily's approach. Many of them had fought in real battles and felt that training focused on intelligence and strategy was not suitable for their needs. Some even questioned whether they really needed instruction from a woman, whom they considered inexperienced in real warfare. However, Emily was undaunted. She knew that this was an important moment to prove that what she was teaching was not just theory, but skills needed in an increasingly unpredictable battlefield. The first day of training began with tension. The elite troops, with all their experience and expertise, were surprised by the type of exercises they were given. Emily introduced them to simulations that required them to think creatively to complete missions, such as using limited resources to create traps, communicating in threatening situations, and surviving in harsh environments. In each scenario, they had to prioritize ingenuity, relying on unconventional tactics to survive and achieve their goals. However, not everything went smoothly. In the middle of training, some members of the elite force began to doubt Emily's approach. One of them, a captain named David Marshall, known for his tough attitude and great respect for physical strength, began to criticize the methods being taught. "This is no place for theory and empty talk, Carter. We're dealing with real enemies, not just simulations," he said harshly. "We need more than just intelligence. We need strength, endurance, and the ability to fight with our bare hands." Emily listened patiently. "Strength is important, Captain Marshall," she replied calmly. "But remember, if we rely solely on physical strength, we will lose in unexpected battles. It's not about being the strongest. It's about being the smartest, the most adaptable to the situation, the quickest to think under pressure." Captain Marshall was not entirely satisfied with her answer, but Emily continued the training without being affected. She knew that her job was to show that a smarter, more planned approach could be more effective than just rushing in with brute force. Day after day, the elite troops began to realize that Emily wasn't just talking about empty theory. In increasingly complex simulations, they began to see the results of the approach she was teaching. In one exercise, they were asked to manage very limited resources to survive in an isolated area. They had to act quickly, solve problems with the limitations at hand, and devise the right strategy to survive. When all members of the elite force successfully completed the exercise, albeit not without difficulty, they began to see the importance of what Emily was teaching. However, Emily knew that the training was far from over. There were still many challenges to face, both for herself and her troops. As they began to increasingly accept her training methods, Emily realized that there was more to prove, especially to those who still doubted that a woman could lead an elite force on the battlefield. One day, after a grueling training session, Emily received word that Colonel Hargrove wanted to speak with her. She felt anxious. Despite having earned recognition before, she knew that this situation could be a turning point in her career. When they met, Colonel Hargrove spoke in a serious tone. "Master Sergeant Carter," he said, "I have something important to tell you. We have decided to give you more responsibility. We are sending you to lead a larger field operation with troops from other units that you have not trained. This mission will be the final test, whether your approach is truly effective on the real battlefield. We will see if you are capable of leading troops in more extreme situations." Emily felt a heaviness in her chest, but at the same time, she knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. Colonel Hargrove continued, "If you succeed, you will not only change our perspective, but also prove that the changes you have brought about can yield real results." Emily nodded. "I'm ready, Colonel. I will prove that this approach can work, not only for the troops I train, but for the entire military." Colonel Hargrove nodded and stood up, signaling for them to end the conversation. "We will arrange the mission. Make sure you are ready, because this will be your biggest test." With newfound determination and confidence, Emily returned to her base to prepare for the big mission ahead. She knew this was an inevitable test, and with that, she had to be ready to face the greatest challenge of her life. Although the future was full of uncertainty, Emily was ready to show that courage, ingenuity, and mental toughness were what it took to win the battle, on the battlefield and in life. The night before the mission began, Emily stood outside headquarters, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The calm night contrasted with the turmoil inside her. This mission was her last chance to prove to the entire military, and to herself, that the approach she taught, a strategy that prioritized ingenuity and team collaboration, could indeed lead to victory. However, Emily knew that the challenges she faced would not be easy. This was the toughest test of her career. This mission would involve several units that Emily had never trained before. They would face highly trained enemies in an area full of traps and difficult terrain. Emily knew that one small mistake could lead to a major failure. On the other hand, she also realized that this was the right time to prove that the tactics she was implementing could be more effective than simply relying on physical strength or reckless frontal attacks. The next day, Emily led the troops to the designated location. It was a remote and difficult-to-reach area, full of natural obstacles that made it the perfect place for a test. The combined forces consisted of various units, each with different skills. However, Emily had to ensure that they could work together as a unit, not just operate separately. When they first entered the area, they were greeted by dense forests covering all directions. The unpredictable weather and obstacle-filled terrain added to their difficulties. Emily began dividing her troops into several groups, each with specific tasks, gathering information, building defensive posts, and preparing evacuation plans if needed. This was an exercise that tested their ability to work together, share information, and plan each step carefully. The mission started smoothly, and Emily could sense that there was tension among her troops. Some of them were not yet accustomed to working with a more strategic approach and still relied on instinct to act quickly. But Emily did not let that interfere with the mission. Calmly, she gave clear orders and made sure each group knew what to do. However, when they began to enter more open territory, enemy forces that had been waiting there launched an attack. Emily's initial plan was to confuse the enemy by taking advantage of the terrain. They spread out, using trees and rocks to hide, while some of the front troops distracted the enemy with light fire. The situation became even more tense when the enemy forces began to launch a more coordinated counterattack. They used unpredictable guerrilla tactics, with deep attacks that forced Emily and her troops to move quickly. Emily realized that they had to hold their position, but also had to be smart in choosing the right time to counterattack. Carefully, she gave the order to retreat to a safer position, but close enough to the enemy to launch a deadly counterattack. The counterattack began with a barrage of targeted fire, which successfully deceived the enemy forces. Several members of the elite force who had previously been skeptical of Emily's methods began to see the results of the tactics she had taught them. They began to understand that every move had to be calculated, and every attack had to be based on careful analysis, not just rash courage. As they began to gain control of the field, Emily decided to launch a final attack that would end the battle. She ordered several groups to move simultaneously, diverting the enemy's attention with attacks from two directions. The enemy troops, caught in this deep attack, began to be pushed back, and eventually they retreated to a more distant position. With the final attack successful, Emily and her troops managed to take control of the area. The seemingly impossible mission was accomplished with a strategy that prioritized ingenuity over strength. Emily stood in the middle of the field, watching her troops begin to celebrate their victory. They had succeeded, and more importantly, they had succeeded by working together in a way they had never tried before. Emily's approach of prioritizing teamwork, strategic thinking, and ingenuity had proven effective. Back at headquarters after the mission, Emily was summoned by Colonel Hargrove. Hargrove faced her with a smile he rarely showed. "Master Sergeant," he said, "I have to admit, you've proven yourself. What you taught this team not only worked, but it produced extraordinary results. We didn't just win this battle, but we learned a lot about how to fight with ingenuity and mental strength. You've changed the way we view training." Emily felt the heaviness in her chest begin to lift. Though no words were spoken, she knew that a major change had taken place. "This is just the beginning, Colonel," she replied humbly. "I believe we can continue to grow. It's not just about winning battles. It's about how we can survive and win in bigger battles." Colonel Hargrove nodded, as if understanding that Emily was not only an effective trainer, but an inspiring leader. We will continue to support this program, Carter. You have shown that the military can evolve, and we will make room for that. Emily smiled faintly. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey. Major changes were underway, and she was ready to continue leading her troops toward a brighter future. After Emily's great victory, everything seemed to change at Fort Moore. However, even though the atmosphere at headquarters was more open and the troops were growing stronger, new challenges began to arise. Emily now faced a different kind of pressure, a greater responsibility. Having proven herself in real combat, she began to be invited to speak at various military forums and was involved in strategic planning for other units. The program she initially considered to be just a training experiment has now developed into a model adopted by more troops across the country. However, Emily realizes that not everyone is happy with this change. Some still feel that the methods she teaches are not deeply rooted in the harsh military tradition. Nevertheless, Emily knows that in order to move forward, she must face these challenges head-on. Many see her as a threat, while others see her as a symbol of progress. One bright morning, Emily received a message from Colonel Hargrove asking to meet. There was a big meeting that would involve several high-ranking military officials. "I want you to attend this meeting, Master Sergeant," Colonel Hargrove said over the phone. "We will discuss the implementation of your training program at a higher level. We need your voice in this discussion." Emily felt a little anxious. This was a great opportunity, but she also knew that not everyone was ready to listen to the changes she brought. She prepared herself thoroughly, thinking about every word and answer she might give. As soon as the meeting began, the atmosphere was tense. In front of her sat several high-ranking military officials who had once doubted her approach. They looked at her skeptically, as if waiting for an opportunity to shoot down her proposal. "Master Sergeant Carter," said one of the senior officials in a heavy voice, "your training program has been successful in simulations, but is this enough to face real threats on the battlefield? We need proof that your strategy can actually be applied in a broader scenario." Emily knew that this was the moment to show more than just theory. "We have already proven its effectiveness in real field missions, with challenges far greater than those in simulations," she replied firmly. "This strategy is not just about survival. It's about creating a force that can adapt and think quickly in the face of unexpected situations." However, some officials remained unconvinced. Intelligence will not always be enough when our enemies have physical superiority and greater strength. We want to see more tangible evidence, not just training philosophy. Emily looked at them with confidence. "We have conducted simulations and field missions with troops from various units. We have defeated enemy forces that were better trained and outnumbered us. What you call concrete evidence is something we have already done. It's not just about fighting the enemy, but how we can survive and win in the face of uncertainty." The atmosphere in the meeting room grew tense. Several officials looked at each other, considering whether to accept this change or stick to the old ways. Colonel Hargrove, sitting next to Emily, finally spoke up. "We've seen the results, and we can't close our eyes to the fact that this program has made our troops more effective. Emily, you've shown that these tactics work." After a tense moment, the decision was finally made. Colonel Hargrove announced that Emily's training program would continue and even be expanded to more units. However, there was one condition: the program would continue to be closely evaluated and reviewed. Emily felt relieved, but she knew that this was only a temporary victory. "Thank you, Colonel," Emily replied, holding her head high. "I promise, I will make sure that we continue to improve and prove that this is the right way." After the meeting, Emily returned to headquarters with mixed feelings. She knew that even though this was a big step forward, the road ahead was still long and full of challenges. Some people might still have doubts, and there were still many battles to be fought, both on the battlefield and in debates about the best way to train troops. However, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. For the first time, the training program she had introduced was widely recognized. But Emily also realized that change was not something that could happen overnight. It was a long journey that required patience, perseverance, and the belief that what she was teaching was right. The following days at Fort Moore were filled with preparations for the further implementation of the training program. Her troops were becoming more skilled, and they were beginning to feel the benefits of a more strategic approach. However, Emily also had to face the reality that not everyone was ready to accept this change, and she would continue to face challenges from those who refused to move forward. One night, as Emily sat alone in her office, she reflected. This training program may have brought about significant change, but she also knew that to truly change the military's mindset, she would have to keep fighting. Not only for herself, but for a better future for the next generation of soldiers. Emily Carter would never stop fighting, for herself, for her troops, and for greater change in the military world. After her meeting with Colonel Hargrove, Emily returned to the field with renewed enthusiasm. The program she introduced began to spread more widely. Military units from various regions began to adopt her approach, and although many were skeptical, the results that began to appear made Emily even more confident in the direction she had taken. However, she also realized that the biggest challenge came not from outside, but from within herself. Emily knew that to truly change the system, she had to continue to innovate and not be satisfied with what had already been achieved. One morning, Emily received a call from Colonel Hargrove informing her that a new mission had been assigned to her. This was a very important mission, a mission to rescue troops trapped in enemy territory. The troops were isolated in very difficult conditions, and only those with special skills in surviving in harsh terrain could rescue them. Emily was asked to lead a rescue team consisting of elite troops from various units. However, this mission was not just about rescuing the trapped troops. It was a major test for the program Emily was running. Colonel Hargrove said, "This mission is not only a test for your soldiers, Carter. It is also a test for your approach. If you fail, we will consider further evaluating the continuation of this program." The pressure was mounting. Emily knew that this mission would be a turning point. Success or failure in this mission would determine whether she could truly bring about change in the way military forces were trained and operated. Upon arriving at the designated location, Emily felt an incredible tension. The trapped troops were on a hill surrounded by enemy forces, with very limited evacuation routes. The rescue team led by Emily consisted of various elements: navigators, divers, engineers, and troops trained in guerrilla warfare. This mission required not only technical expertise, but also a well-thought-out strategy that went beyond physical strength. Calmly, Emily planned the first steps. We will move in separate formations. The first group will approach the enemy lines to find a gap we can use to get in. The second group will act as backup if we need to move quickly. The third group, we will disguise ourselves and distract the enemy. The hard work began. The team moved through the dense forest, avoiding enemy patrols, and carefully searching for a safe path to the trapped troops' position. Every step they took was carefully considered. There was no room for error. Emily led with confidence, but also with caution, ensuring that every decision was based on careful calculation. In situations like this, a leader must not only know when to act, but also when to wait, so that their troops do not fall into a trap. That night, as they got closer to the enemy's position, one of the rescue troops reported, "Emily, we found a blocked route. There's a big trap on the main path." Emily looked at the map and quickly planned an alternate route. "Don't panic. We'll move a little further to the left. No one will know we're there if we move carefully." The journey became increasingly difficult, but Emily and her team managed to navigate through trap after trap with the ingenuity they had learned during training. However, suddenly, they were caught in a direct confrontation with enemy forces larger than they had anticipated. The battle erupted quickly. Emily immediately ordered her troops to spread out, diverting the enemy's attention. Use this terrain to our advantage. Focus on problem-solving, not just attacking. We have to be smarter. With confidence, Emily led a counterattack relying on the tactics she had taught her troops. They attacked with precision, using effective traps and coordinated attacks. Emily saw her troops begin to work as she had taught them, thinking faster, acting intelligently, and always maintaining effective communication. As the enemy retreated, Emily and her team continued their journey to the trapped troops. They finally arrived at the location and immediately evacuated the isolated troops. The mission was completed with resounding success. The trapped troops were rescued, and the enemy was successfully repelled without much loss. At headquarters, Colonel Hargrove met Emily with a big smile on his face. "You have proven that your tactics can be applied in real-world situations. These are outstanding results, Carter." However, Emily knew that what happened during the mission was not just about victory. It was a test of the approach she had been taking all along. This mission proved that ingenuity, cooperation, and strategy-based leadership could defeat greater physical strength. "Nothing about this journey has been easy, Colonel," Emily replied humbly. But we are one step closer to proving that this approach can work, even in the most challenging situations. Emily looked at her troops, who were now back safe and sound, with a sense of relief but also determination. The change had already begun, but the long journey had only just started. New challenges would always arise, but Emily knew that with each victory, they were all getting closer to achieving greater change in the military world. She was ready to face whatever came her way, confident that ingenuity and skill were the keys to survival and victory on the uncertain battlefield. After a successful rescue mission, Emily Carter's name became increasingly well known in military circles. Her success in leading troops through a highly risky mission proved that her approach was not just theory, but could survive on the real battlefield. However, even though many recognized her success, Emily still felt that the real journey had only just begun. Now she must face an even greater challenge: to change the way of thinking within the military, including among high-ranking leaders. However, after the mission, Emily realized that there was much to be improved, and not everyone was ready to accept the changes she brought. Some superiors who were initially skeptical began to acknowledge the effectiveness of her program, but there were still those who were concerned about methods that prioritized ingenuity over physical strength alone. Emily knew that she had to show more concrete results to convince them that these changes were worth fighting for. One morning, Emily received an invitation to meet with several high-ranking military officials, including several generals who had long been involved in conventional warfare. They asked Emily to present the results of the training program she had developed. Emily knew that this was an opportunity to leave a deeper mark on military history. It was not only about defending her program, but also about changing a paradigm that had long been ingrained in many people's minds. In the large meeting room, Emily stood confidently in front of the generals and other military officials. In front of her, a large screen displayed data on the results of the training and missions that had been carried out. Emily began calmly, explaining the steps she had taken to develop training methods that prioritized tactics, strategy, and teamwork. Generals, I want to show you that our success is not just about survival. We have succeeded in creating a force that is smarter, more adaptable, and better prepared to face unexpected threats, Emily said with confidence. One of the generals, the conservative General Thomas, raised his hand and said, "But how can we be sure that this intelligence will be enough when we face a stronger enemy? Physical strength is still important, and we cannot ignore that." Emily nodded understandingly. Physical strength is important, General, but in many situations, tactics and intelligence will be more decisive. We have proven this in field missions. When our troops faced enemies that were much larger and stronger, we were able to defeat them in a more intelligent, more organized, and more measured way. Emily continued by showing various simulations and data that revealed how troops trained with this strategic approach had defeated enemies who were superior in terms of physical strength. She emphasized that this success was not just due to luck, but to learned skills, namely how to utilize the terrain, work as a team, and think quickly in critical situations. Although some officials still seemed skeptical, Emily felt that she had presented enough evidence to defend her methods. In those few hours of challenging meetings, she managed to convince several generals that the changes she was bringing about could benefit the troops, and that the military did not have to choose between physical strength and intelligence. The two could complement each other. After the meeting ended, Colonel Hargrove approached Emily with a slight smile. "You did it, Carter. They're starting to see the results of the program you brought in. Even though some are still skeptical, this is a big step." Emily smiled slightly, feeling relieved but still cautious. "This is just the beginning, Colonel. Even though they're starting to accept these changes, we still have many challenges ahead of us. But at least we've laid a stronger foundation." Shortly after the meeting, Emily received exciting news. Her training program would be implemented across all military units in the region, and she was given the responsibility of overseeing its implementation. It was a huge victory, but Emily knew she had to maintain the integrity of the program and continue to refine her methods. The change was not yet complete, and she would continue to work hard to realize a greater vision. However, as she stood behind her desk at headquarters, Emily reflected for a moment. Although she had succeeded in bringing about a major change in the way troops were trained, she realized that the biggest challenge was to inspire the next generation to see strength in wisdom, in ingenuity, and in the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. Emily Carter was not just fighting for herself or for her training program. She was fighting to create a more advanced military, one that was better prepared to face an uncertain future. And although her journey was not always easy, she knew that the small steps she was taking today would leave a big mark on the future. Looking out the window of her office, Emily knows that her journey has only just begun. There are many obstacles ahead, but she is ready to face them. With confidence and courage, Emily Carter will continue to challenge the boundaries, for herself, for her troops, and for a better military future. The days following the implementation of the broader training program felt increasingly full of responsibility. Emily knew that this success was not just about her or her team, but about shaping a smarter, more adaptive, and stronger military future in the face of unexpected threats. However, despite this great achievement, Emily realized that she had to stay focused on what was most important: changing the overall military culture. 1 month after the program was implemented across all units, Emily received news that she had been asked to lead a national military conference that would discuss troop training and development. This was a golden opportunity to speak in front of high-ranking officials from all branches of the military, and to show once again that the changes she was bringing about were not just a passing trend, but a revolution in the way troops were trained and prepared for increasingly complex warfare. The conference was held in a magnificent building filled with generals, high-ranking officers, and military academics. Emily stood at the podium, looking out at an audience full of faces accustomed to the old ways. This time, however, she felt no hesitation. She had been through many battles, on the battlefield, on rescue missions, and in high-pressure boardrooms. Emily knew that this was her moment to leave a lasting legacy. In her speech, Emily talked about how the world of war had changed. She emphasized that ingenuity, cooperation, and the ability to adapt quickly were increasingly important elements in facing modern threats. Physical strength is important, she said, but in many situations, the ability to think quickly and work in a solid team will be more decisive than how strong we are physically. She continued by sharing the results of the training program she had introduced. She presented data, case studies, and even video footage illustrating how troops trained using this method had successfully overcome challenges far greater than they had anticipated. Emily didn't just talk about theory, but provided concrete evidence illustrating the success of her approach. "I know this isn't an easy change," she continued, "especially for those who have long held on to existing traditions. But we must dare to think differently. Today's military world is far more dynamic and uncertain than ever before. We cannot continue to cling to old ways that rely solely on physical strength and endurance." After her speech, there was a long pause filled with silence. Emily could feel the tension that enveloped the room, but she also knew that what she had said had sunk in. A voice from the back row broke the silence. "What you said, Master Sergeant, is true. We have seen the results. Your program has indeed brought about real change." The words came from General Thomas, who had previously been one of her harshest critics. As he stood up and gave Emily his public endorsement, the mood in the room changed. Although many were still skeptical, they began to realize that what Emily was fighting for was not just a theory, but a solution that could be applied in the real world. The conference ended with an increasingly open discussion about how these new training methods could be expanded to other units across the country. Emily felt that this was a very important moment in her journey. Perhaps not everyone would fully accept this change, but she knew that the small steps she had taken had left a deep mark. The trust given to her to lead this program throughout the military proved that her struggles had not been in vain. The following days at Fort Moore were filled with further evaluation and planning for the implementation of the training program across the armed forces. Emily was given greater responsibility to lead change at the national level, ensuring that this proven methodology could be widely applied. She also began training new instructors who would help her spread the program across the country, ensuring that her legacy would live on and grow. However, despite all her achievements, Emily did not feel that she had accomplished everything. Deep down, she knew that the big change she wanted was not just about one program or one big success. Real change is a long journey that requires patience, dedication, and unflagging enthusiasm. One evening, after a full day of meetings and discussions, Emily sat alone in her office. She looked back at old photos from her early days when she first joined the military. She remembered how she had once doubted her own abilities, how she had struggled to gain recognition as a woman in a male-dominated world. But all that had changed. Emily knew that her journey was far from over. There was much to achieve, and much to fight for. But one thing was certain: she had left an indelible mark on the military world. She had proven that intelligence and strategy were not just complements to strength, but also key factors in winning battles. More than that, she had proven that anyone, regardless of background or gender, could be a great leader if given the opportunity to develop and demonstrate their abilities. Emily gazed out the window, watching the stars in the night sky. The journey may be long and full of challenges, but she is ready to keep moving forward, confident that every step she takes brings the military world one step closer to a future that is smarter, fairer, and better prepared for any possibility.